Welcome to What's Up Poland, the regular news show about Poland. Will or would Russia invade Poland? Well, actually, that's a question that only one person on this planet can answer. And let's hope that we never find out the answer to that question. But I'd like to offer a few thoughts about a potential Russian incursion, invasion, or some kind of attack on Poland. Now, as many people have observed, Poland was one of the Central and Eastern European countries that has been shouting the loudest about Russian aggression over the decades and years, including Georgia, of course, going back some time, talking about how it was a threat to NATO's eastern flank. Now, I have noticed in the last couple of weeks, more people talking, both geopolitical strategists to Second World War heroes that I've seen online, to private citizens talking about whether Russia would attack Poland. I remember feeling, quite frankly, shaken to the core when I saw a quote from the Polish Prime Minister, Mateusz Morawiecki, that what we're doing to support Ukraine is for a very simple reason: we're next. I remember when I first came to Poland, I was teaching English like a lot of foreigners do when they come to Poland. And I asked a group of 3 engineers in an electrical plant, do you think there'll ever be a war in Poland? And one of the answers of one of the guys kind of shocked me, actually, because it was a very different way of seeing the world than the one I had at the time. He said, well, there's been a war in Poland every 40 or so years, so why would it be any different? That's what Poland's history is. It's a history, it's a checkered history of war and triumph, but mostly of disaster and despair, of great individual brilliance, but a lot of failure as well, a lot of heroic brilliance as well, as best exemplified by the Warsaw Uprising. Now, we're not going to get into all of that, but I mention all of this because I think it's helpful for foreign observers who don't really understand Poland at all, who haven't really sat down with an old babcha like I did 11, 12, 13 years ago and say, who did you hate more? Seems to me a stupid question. The Nazis or the Soviets? And I was expecting her to say the Nazis, and she went, Soviets. And I was so surprised because it so shook my worldview. And I think a lot of foreign observers, news correspondents who popped into Poland for a little bit, went to the border and were surprised to find out the Poles are actually really good at organizing themselves, don't really get this about the mentality here. If you've lived in a country like I have for most of my adult life, up until I was 27 in the UK, your country hasn't known an invasion, proper real invasion, for 1,000 years. 1,000 years of uninterrupted non-invasions. Whereas, as the guy in the plant said, well, there's been a war every 40 years, so why wouldn't there be? So I mention all of this to explain why it is that people might be taking the Russian threat a heck of a lot seriously than a lot of, quote, Western observers might. Now, what I've been saying to people is, don't worry, we're part of NATO, right? So like Article 5 and all of that. And there's no reason to believe that NATO's faith in Article 5 isn't secure. But I remember digging into the White House records when I was back at university 20 years ago studying international relations. And I was struck then by a passage that just stuck with me decades later. Ronald Reagan in private remarks in a White House meeting saying, I'm not going to go to war for Solidarność. You know, if Russia invades Poland because of martial law and Solidarność, like, we're not going to get involved in that. Realpolitik ultimately will always triumph. And we just have to recognize that. Would America and the NATO allies go to war for a tiny little bit of Poland? Well, their little bit of Poland has been what's raising a lot of geopolitical strategists' eyes, the so-called Suvalky Gap, which is the thin strip of Polish territory which divides Poland from the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and also connects Kaliningrad, this bizarre chunk of Russia in which there's a large number of troops and not a huge amount of else, with the rest of mainland Russia. Now, some geopolitical strategists and future war analysis are saying that Putin's army, as weakened as it could be, is still quite capable of launching a quick attack across that gap, taking it in less than 24 hours, presenting it to the world as a fait accompli, and essentially saying, you know, sorry, guys, but really, you're going to go to war over a tiny little bit of land. That would be an invasion of Poland, albeit a small one, and it would enable Russia to link up with Kaliningrad and also isolate the Baltic states. Now, I don't know if that's a possibility, but I do know that some people are saying that Poland should probably look at that strip of land and think about it. We've also seen a large number of worrying and increasing pieces of content and information from people, from examples such as the former Prime Minister Dimitry Medvedev, talking about Poland as frankly being the biggest pain in the neck for Russia. The source of all of the munitions that are coming over, if not the munitions, then the training for it. The largest base of support for Ukraine is coming from Poland. So there's plenty of signs coming from Russian sources that Poland needs to watch out. I'm often asked the question, hey, you British guy, say you're Polish, or would you fight for Poland? And I have this approach. I refuse to answer that question because I know that talk is cheap. Like what I'm talking to you about now is cheap. It doesn't cost anything. I could say whatever I like. I could say, yeah, I'm going to stand and fight to the last man. I have learned something from the last month of war, which is war is this horrible, beastly thing which tests you in ways you'll never know. And you can talk the talk, but until you actually go through that experience, it's best to keep your mouth shut. There are men who have fled Ukraine and aren't fighting, whereas there are women who've stayed and are. There are people who never thought they'd find themselves in uniform with a gun in their hand who are fighting, from the young to the elderly. I don't know if, as a father and as a citizen of this country, if I'll ever be called to. And I don't know how I would be able to react. I know one thing, once you're under fire, your legs turn to jelly, your bowels turn into ground powder, you have no idea what you're going to do under fire. So you can stay, but can you be an effective fighter? Well, I'll answer my question in my own time if I have to, but I don't believe in bragging about fighting to the last man and all that kind of stuff because talk is cheap. Actions speak louder than words. What the people of Poland are doing, however, is taking the threat seriously. I've recently spent some time with some people doing their gun license tests, and I can assure you that the ability to own a gun and possess it in a time of trouble has been pretty damn helpful to a lot of people in Ukraine who recently received their AK-47s for the first time. It would be a lot better if you had a few thousand rounds of training down there. So I saw Polish people doing that. Poland also took the decision to expand its army. I think it's going to go from 150,000 to 300,000 troops. And we've seen what irregular militias can do. And that's one of the reasons why many people are now saying that the current government's decision to bring in a territorial armed forces, the so-called VOT, Wojskowa Obrona Terytorialna, has been a wise one, because you can see what these mosquito packs of little lightly armored troops with anti-tank rockets and surface-to-air missile rockets can do. Will Russia invade Poland? Well, we're members of NATO, so it would be crazy, right? Well, I remember listening to one respected analyst in I think it was a New York Times or a Washington Post podcast say that Putin will never invade Ukraine. It's just geopolitics. He's just squeezing that lemon for as much as he wanted. Hope for peace. Prepare for war.